I moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago because the house had history. Wide oak floors, a porch that sagged just enough to feel honest, and a backyard that caught the afternoon light like it was saving it for later. I paid cash, signed papers, and fixed things one at a time. The roof, the heater, the loose banister. The place became mine in a way that was slow and deliberate, like learning a song by ear. At first, the homeowners association was background noise, rules tucked into an envelope, newsletters folded beside the recycling bin. Then Karen arrived. She called herself a volunteer, but she wore the kind of smile that got other people to volunteer for her. She walked the streets like she owned the sidewalks, complained about sprinklers in the color of roses, and knocked on doors to tell people what they should be doing with their mailboxes. Everyone else seemed to grin and nod. I smiled back once, politely, and then kept my distance. Our conflict started with something small. A mailbox post painted one shade darker than the community guide allowed. She wrote me a note. I fixed it. Then she served me a notice about a violation for a trash bin that had been behind my garage for 2 days while I waited for a pickup. I called to argue and was told the board had spoken. The board, I eventually learned, consisted of people who didn't push back against Karen. That was the pattern. Karen identified a problem, whether real or imagined, and then marshaled resources so it felt official. One autumn night I came home to find the deadbolt sticking. It had been sticking for a while, actually. The previous tenant had left a cheap lock that worked until it didn't. I ordered a new deadbolt, the kind with the heavy latch and smooth action. The locksmith who came out was polite and efficient, like a professional who respected the idea of someone owning a thing and making it secure. He worked in the twilight, and we chatted about the neighborhood. He said he'd been called to homes where neighbors assumed they had the right to oversee private property, and he rolled his eyes at the absurdity. I changed the locks. I kept the old key ring for a while out of habit. No notices arrived. No one complained. Then, a week later at breakfast, I heard the knock that only one person in the neighborhood knocks with. 3 quick raps, a pause, then 3 more. It was Karen's rhythm. She stood on my porch like she was waiting for a ceremony. Her mouth had that precise smile I had seen before, the one that meant she had rehearsed a complaint. "You changed the locks," she said. It wasn't a question. "You can't do that. You have to tell the HOA. We have rules." "I own the house," I said. "There's no need to tell anyone about changing a lock. You can't just exclude us," she said, like exclusion was a neighborhood service. "We have rights. We need access to check things, to enforce our rules. You don't decide what's right for the whole community." I invited her to sit. She refused. She preferred to stand like a judge announcing a ruling. She reached for her phone the way people reach for a script, and as she fumbled, she said, "I'm calling 911. At first I thought she was joking. It was absurd enough that my brain tried to place it as a punchline. But she dialed, and a calm voice came through the phone. 911, what's your emergency?" And the way she spoke into it made it sound like she had already drawn a map of the story she planned to tell. She put the phone on speaker for me to hear. "This neighbor changed their locks," Karen told the operator, as if that were a threat. "They may be barricading residents. It's suspicious. I'm asking for officers to check. She is running people out of the neighborhood. She says she owns the house, but she is acting like she's excluding residents." The operator asked basic questions, an address, the nature of the complaint. Karen spoke in short, emphatic bursts and sprinkled the call with the kind of phrases that are supposed to make the police interested, suspicious, threat, uncooperative. It was theater. I realized then that she was creating an emergency where there was none, stuffing the script full of words that pulled the police into the neighborhood without anyone having actually been harmed. When the patrol cars arrived, they slowed. 2 cars, lights off for now, tires ticking on our street. A young officer knocked on the screen door. He had the look of someone who expected polite but otherwise mundane problems. I told him the locksmith had changed my locks on my own property and that there was no threat. I explained calmly, offered to show him the deed and the invoice for the locksmith. He asked me to step outside. Karen hovered on the sidewalk like she had never left a courtroom. She told the officers how she was looking out for the neighborhood and painted a portrait of me as someone who would suddenly lock neighbors out for reasons no one would understand. The officers listened patiently and asked a few questions about the address and the occupant. They checked my ID, glanced at the deed, then made a note and wished Karen a good evening. It was over in 20 minutes. I thought that would be the end of it, a ridiculous anecdote I could share over drinks. Instead, the HOA sent a letter 3 days later. The letter cited a covenant I had never read, a paragraph about reasonable access for the association to perform inspections and maintenance. It said I had to provide reasonable notice before changing locks that could affect community access. It was thin, legalese wrapped in an authoritative tone, like a menu that pretended the food was mandatory. I called the HOA board, asked to see the covenant's exact clause, and requested the minutes from the meeting where this rule had been added. The board member who returned my call was gentle in a way that explained why Karen had sway. He said the letter was standard, that the HOA had to be consistent. When I asked for minutes, he hemmed and hawed. "They're being compiled," he said. "We'll get them to you." Days turned to weeks. Notices about fines, reminders, and a meeting invitation arrived. The meeting subject line said, "Safety and security concerns." Karen had spread a narrative. I was someone closing myself off, a hazard to the neighborhood's communal nature. People began to glance when I walked by. The barista down the street asked if everything was okay. Strangers muttered in grocery aisles. The feeling was subtle but corrosive. A community's whisper can be louder than a siren. I began to document everything. The locksmith's invoice, my deed, copies of every letter the HOA sent, photographs of the lock before and after, and a log of every interaction with Karen. It felt bureaucratic and sad, like wrapping a bandage around a wound that was still being inflicted. At the next HOA meeting, the room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and printer toner. Chairs were arranged like a small amphitheater. Karen stood at the front and presented slides she had made, each one a collection of complaints. She used phrases like precedent, community standards, and committee oversight. When she described an incident at my house, the audience nodded in the way audiences nod at well-rehearsed lines. I rose to speak. Instead of accusing, I told a story, the history of the house, the repairs, the night spent mending a sill. I explained why I changed the lock, for the safety of my sleep, the security of my family heirlooms, the finality that comes with a home you can't imagine losing. I offered copies of the locksmith's invoice and showed the deed. I asked the board if there was any legal basis for the demand that I provide notice to change a lock. There was a pause as the room waited for the verdict. Someone on the board, not Karen, someone who had been courteous to me in the past, read the covenant clause aloud. The language was vague, almost apologetic in its own phrasing. Reasonable access, it said, for the association to perform inspections. No deadline, no mention of locks or keys. The board looked from the clause to Karen, and the air in the room shifted slightly. She tried to argue that reasonable notice included notifying the HOA, but there was no foundation for that claim. After 2 hours of debate, the board formed a small review committee to clarify the clause. It was a temporary victory. Karen's smile didn't change, but the weapon had dulled. The neighborhood's attention moved on to something else, a report about sidewalk cracks, a lost dog, and I breathed again. But Karen wasn't done. She escalated in subtler ways. She began to organize volunteers to help with neighborhood watch. The volunteers, it turned out, enjoyed the sense of having authority. They started sending polite but pointed letters to homes with hedges that grew beyond acceptable height, and to residents who had parked in driveways instead of garages. She pushed for stricter fines and longer grace periods. The HOA board, wary and impressionable, leaned in. When my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, missed a fine notice for a month, Karen drove to her house and lectured her on civic responsibility. I watched from my window as a woman who had lived on the block for 40 years was reduced to a trembling apology. I started to understand that our community wasn't about support. It was about control. One night, the control nearly broke into my life. I returned home after a week away to find a man in a blazer standing on my porch with a clipboard and a badge that said OA Inspector. He claimed he was there to inspect fire safety. He wanted to check my locks to ensure community safety. He said the HOA had received a complaint about a door that might be inaccessible from the outside. I showed him the deed and told him no one had permission to enter without my consent. The inspector's face was polite but blank, the face of someone who took instructions and delivered them without thinking about the people involved. He asked, almost mechanically, if there were ways for the HOA to gain access in an emergency. I suggested he list emergency contacts and keep copies of contact information at the fire department and with neighbors who volunteered. He nodded like he had already recorded it. Karen, of course, was there. She lingered at the end of the lawn with a neighbor who loved the idea of helping. Her eyes found mine, and for a sliver of a second, I felt the pressure she wanted to exert. the suggestion that privacy was a betrayal of community. I realized then that this wasn't just about keys and rules. It was about power and how people like Karen gather it the way others gather stamps, slowly, obsessively, and with a careful order. People who enjoy making lists and enforcing them tend to move into positions where lists become law. The more they enforce, the more authority they feel entitled to. That hunger had started small, with mailboxes and trash bins, and was now aiming at the sanctity of someone's front door. I decided to make a different kind of move. I reached out to other neighbors, not to complain but to ask questions. I wanted to know who had been called by Karen in the past and what had happened. I wanted to show how often notices were driven by one person's insistence rather than a community's consensus. I discovered a pattern. People had been shamed into compliance, and when they pushed back, they were met with an organized resistance that wore the garb of protecting the neighborhood. Together, we hosted a casual potluck in the park. We invited people across the block, including those who had been on Karen's mailing list and those who had quietly paid fines because resistance felt lonely. We listened to stories about fences, about holiday lights, about the subtle ways one person can make others feel watched. The potluck wasn't about strategy, it was about community. People began to speak not from prepared scripts, but from memory and heart. Empowered by the potluck, a small group of neighbors attended the next HOA meeting. We asked for transparency, for recorded votes, for a clear definition of reasonable access, and for the right to see minutes in a timely manner. We pushed for mediation before fines were issued. We didn't shout. We brought cookies and copies of suggested covenant language. The board couldn't dismiss a room full of faces who had eaten together. Karen tried to keep her smile. She spoke about safety and standards, about how maintaining a cohesive aesthetic protected property values. But when asked directly if she had called 911 over a lock change, she faltered. Her voice, normally brisk, softened. "I was concerned," she said. "I called because I didn't want anyone to be excluded." "Excluded from what?" someone asked. "From the neighborhood," she said. We pressed for limits on what the HOA could demand. Could they require keys? Could they force entry? Could they call the police over an owner's decision? The answers were no on paper, and the board agreed to draft clearer, enforceable language that respected ownership rights and limited HOA access to true emergencies. It was a compromise, imperfect but useful. A month later, a new clause was added to the covenant that explicitly stated the HOA could not demand keys or require notice for routine changes like changing a lock, absent a court order, or a bona fide emergency verified by local authorities. It required that any complaint that led to a police call be accompanied by documented attempts at mediation. It also mandated accessible minutes in a public forum. The changes weren't revolutionary, but they were enough to keep Karen's worst instincts in check. After the change, Karen's calls to 911 became less frequent and more cautious. She adapted. She formed committees of volunteers who walked the neighborhoods with measuring tapes and a smile, but their letters carried less bite because the board required evidence and a second vote before any fine. The neighborhood noticed. The whispers died down. There were personal victories, too. One neighbor, who'd been fined for a tiny fence that matched his architectural style, had his fine rescinded after the minutes showed the HOA had not followed procedure. Mrs. Alvarez received a standing ovation at the next potluck when she told people to mind their own porch lights and smiled like she'd reclaimed something. I never relished the confrontation. I disliked spotlight and petitioning and legalese, but I learned the cost of complacency. If you silently accept rules that bend logic, you surrender something that matters. If you let one person define community without an accountability framework, you give tyranny a porch to stand on. Maybe the most important lesson came on an ordinary Tuesday when I was watering my front gardens and Karen walked by, carrying a box of notices. We exchanged a glance that had once been a battle line. This time she hesitated. "Morning," she said, and there was no rehearsed edge to it. "Morning," I answered. "The roses look good." "They do," she said. "You're doing a good job." For a moment, it was simple neighborliness. Then she nodded and kept walking. I didn't expect an apology. Control rarely gestures that way. But the neighborhood had shifted from a place where one person could ring an alarm for their own amusement to some place where rules required more than one voice to enforce. It felt sturdier. If I had to sum it up, I'd say this. Doors are more than wood and metal. They are edges where private life meets public curiosity. Changing a lock was a small act of care for my home, but it became a catalyst for a conversation we all needed to have about respect and power. We learned that community matters and we stand together,